Hello, everyone. You could have. You guys think I should just stop with this intro? I'm getting kind of tired of saying it in the beginning of every single video. And yet, I feel obligated to do so based on completely arbitrary reasons. And Resident Evil 4. This is one of the greatest games I have ever played. Let me make that clear right from the get go. I have spent hours upon hours of my mere existence playing this game across my yes, that's right, 6 playthroughs. The only games that even come close to matching that feat are Devil May Cry 3 and Doom Eternal, both of which I had a period during my life where I was completely obsessed with it. But anyway, so yeah, I love this game a whole lot, and so do a majority of the people who played it. It's definitely one of the most beloved titles of all time. All time. Like, you go look up what is like the greatest video games of all time, and I guarantee you will see Resident Evil 4 there. Go to like a gaming site like Backlog or Glitchwave. You're gonna see them in like the all-time like top 50 and have like a ridiculously high fucking rating. Yes, that many people love it, and it's for good reason too. It's not difficult to understand why it's garnered the amount of praise that it has. I mean, it basically gave birth to a whole new genre of shooter games, which we like to call over-the-shoulder. Games like Dead Space will go on to elevate the formula and push it to new heights, but Resident Evil 4 is the one that started it all. And usually, whenever a game becomes known for pioneering a certain aspect within the medium, be it big or small, they tend to fare pretty badly with age, but not with Resident Evil 4. Oh no. This game is still among the best of its class, not only within its genre, but within its own IP as well. Resident Evil 4 was known as, for the longest time, the best that Capcom's flagship IP had to offer. That was until a certain game swooped in and stole Resident Evil 4's spotlight. And that game was Resident Evil 4, Proper Punctuation Edition. But enough preamble. What is it exactly that makes Resident Evil 4 so highly acclaimed even to this day? Well, at the start, Resident Evil 4 features pretty much the ideal marriage between their usual horror elements with their newfound action ones. I know that Resident Evil 3 technically started the gradual descent into action, but it wasn't until Resident Evil 4 where the franchise saw its first full-blown action game. No survival elements, but this is where the series basically moved on from its foundation. Resident Evil 4, it was planting the seeds, but Resident Evil 4 is where it blossomed into this huge, towering, beautiful rose. With the largest variety of weapons to date, the largest enemy encounters with the most amount of enemies, and attention to enemy design and attack patterns, and of course, melee mechanics. But despite its transition into an action-oriented experience, Resident Evil 4 manages to retain some touches of horror that, while not as scary as what fans were used to at the time, still gave us a quiver or two. I'll admit, there really isn't anything in this game that's downright terrifying, except for the regenerators. But the game does have an atmosphere that is consistently tense and, at times, genuinely unsettling. There's just something unnerving about running around in the desolate backwoods of Spain, listening to things like crows and the wind, while also having to stay on your toes because you could be thrown into an intense counter when you're least expecting it. The setting, along with the game's art direction, also adds on to the atmosphere. One good look at the game's opening segments, and you could already tell that something's awry in this place. It's dreary, it's smothered in fog, it's Spanish Silent Hill. The sun doesn't even bother to show up despite it clearly being midday, like, this game is gray and brown as fuck. These three things really bring home that feeling of being isolated in a dangerous and unfamiliar territory. But atmosphere be damned. I think the thing that helps RE4 retain those elements of fear is its sense of urgency, which was achieved thanks to the game's absolutely phenomenal pacing. This game wastes no time in swarming the player with hordes of bloodthirsty enemies. You get a meager little intro, yeah. Kill some poor dude in his own home, yeah. Walk a little bit, yeah. Then, complete and utter mayhem ensues. and it hardly lets up from that point forward. Within the first 5 minutes of playing time, the game reminds you that you are all alone, trapped in a village where every one of its inhabitants are out for blood. And the only time where you're safe, completely safe, is when you're in the aptly titled save room. And that theme, that save room theme, that is like safety personified. Like, that is the musical equivalent of, holy shit, it's over, I can actually take a break now. But the thing that makes the pacing in particular so enthralling is how well the game balances its periods of downtime with the action-packed encounters. The game is definitely overwhelming, but not to where it feels punishing. Nothing overstates its welcome either, nor does anything ever feel too short. Every segment within feels quite appropriate in length, feeding the player with enough atmosphere, action, and cinematic spectacle without it ever losing steam or ever feeling like too much. Not to mention how the intensity of combat encounters increases gradually in a way that feels, I guess you could call it natural. There aren't any difficulty spikes in this game, nor does it ease you in on some of the tougher enemies. The difficulty, intensity, whatever it's of the combat and game in general progresses in a way that makes this feeling of urgency stay completely consistent throughout its entirety. I will now begin to discuss the combat itself, which, out of all the things that Resident Evil 4 has to offer, this is the thing that keeps me coming back. Resident Evil 4 has, without a doubt, my favorite combat system with any shooter ever. Fuck, if it weren't for Kingdom Hearts 2 and Devil May Cry 5, it would have my favorite combat system in any game in general. I wouldn't say it's outright perfect and is absolutely free of flaws, but I will say that it's perfect for what it set out to accomplish. It is a system that manages to pull off a variety of feats, like offering a ton of mechanical depth without having it feel too complicated, enemy design that encourages methodical weapon switching as well as aiming, and finally, to top it all off, we get tank controls, which are essentially the knot that ties this whole combat system together. I know that the game's control scheme catches a lot of flack by idiots who don't know what they're talking about, but to me, I think it's pretty brilliant. Mainly because of how it lends itself to the strategic elements of the game. Resident Evil 4's gameplay is as much about tactical positioning as it is about simply mowing enemies down. The game's primary perspective is a fixed camera angle that hovers just above Leon's shoulder. Even when you're aiming, all you see is this narrow pathway that goes straight forward. You can't tell if an enemy is beside you, behind you, copping a feel, what have you. And these restrictions make for some incredibly tense combat, as you're constantly trying to watch your back while also having to properly position yourself in order to get a decent shot. On paper, these restrictions may sound fucking annoying, and at first, it kind of is. There is a bit of a learning curve, but within the first hour or so, you should be pretty much used to all of this, and you should be able to have fun by then. But anyway, it's the execution that sticks to landing, and results in an unforgettable gameplay loop. What I mean by that is how well the level and enemy design accommodates the game's control scheme. The linear level design is accommodating, and so are the slower movements of your enemies. At first glance, these tank controls may feel like a product of its time, but once you really get yourself used to it, you'll find that it was every bit an intentional design choice, made to offer players a bold, new take on the third-person shooter formula. And those limitations regarding control added an additional layer of intensity to the combat, thus allowing it to still feel like a Resident Evil product. The number of enemies you battle along with the restricted controls can make the game feel overwhelming, but the multitude of mechanics circumvent this by allowing the player to engage with the game in just about any way they can. Calling Resident Evil 4's mechanics complex would be an understatement. There was just so much that went into this game, such as the environmental interactivity, melee commands, and the different properties each and every weapon possesses. Just a fucking shit ton of stuff to discuss. But having cool mechanics is simply one thing. You can present a lot of cool ideas as you please, but if they aren't implemented well, then just forget it. Luckily, this is not the case for Resident Evil 4, as much of its design elements made for a system where players could creatively manage situations that are constantly changing in accordance to how the player reacts to what's being thrown at them. along with what they currently have or don't have in their inventory. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of combat encounters in Resident Evil 4 boil down to staying on your toes and figuring out the best methods around the myriad of circumstances you'll inevitably end up in. But don't worry, for there's always some sort of method you can take, no matter how powerless you may feel at the time. That's how you know you're playing a well-designed game. Anywho, there are a multitude of situations I could reference to help describe this aspect of the game, but to keep things concise, I'm gonna stick with the ones common for most players. I think a common hole players will find themselves in is being too damn low on ammo, but fear not, Mr. Kennedy, for even a single bullet can make all the difference. With the game's admittedly overpowered melee mechanics in mind, one well-timed headshot, a flailing kick to follow it, could seriously alleviate some of the more stressful encounters. Just run around and have the rather monotonous enemies gather around. That way you can unleash a powerful spin kick, knock them all down, and get some knife hits in. If you're accurate enough and time everything well enough, you can seriously cut down on these numerically imposing hordes. A lot of the shit comes down to your skill level and how well you can manage everything surrounding you. And back to those aforementioned melee attacks, they will most likely become your best friend regardless of your ammo supply. This is because of the sheer amount of depth in something so seemingly simple. I already made a mention of the roundhouse kick, which can occur following a clean, non-fatal headshot. But what about the other melee attacks? They're fucking awesome to execute, but also manage to be mechanically interesting as well, as is the gunplay in general. What's interesting about the gunplay is how each and every body part has a different effect on the enemy upon having it get shot. There's also some elements of risk-reward or trade-offs with this mechanic. Shooting an enemy's midsection takes the least amount of skill to pull off, but in turn, it also has the least effect on the enemy. It only staggers them a bit. However, during some cases, it may be best to shoot them in the midsection, because even though it only staggers them for a very short amount of time, it at least gives you enough breathing room for you to back off. So if the enemy's too close and you're too worried about not being able to get a headshot, then this is the method you should take. Shooting them in the arm will have the enemy drop their weapon, assuming they have one. Also, now that I've mentioned it, the player also has the option to shoot projectiles out of the air, which heightens players' quick decision making even further. Like for instance, you notice that an axe is coming right at you, you can just shoot it right down. Or getting back to the pipe bombs, if you notice an enemy has a pipe bomb and it's heading right towards you in midair, you can shoot it in midair and you can kill a ton of enemies at one time. I think encounters with ranged enemies is where the TMP will come in handy the most. Since it has the highest rate of fire, it allows you to stay in the offensive and defensive simultaneously. You'll be able to mow down large crowds of enemies while still being able to knock down any projectiles coming your way. Anywho, getting back to body shots. Shooting enemies in the leg will allow you to kick them back quite a bit. However, you can also get a little risky by circling around them to do a suplex, which is not only fun, but also has the highest chance of instantly killing an enemy out of all the melee moves. There's always so much to think about during encounters, and not only do you have to think fast, but you also have to think smart in order to ensure your survival. And with the sheer mechanical depth this game offers, there is never really a time where you're completely out of options. Resident Evil 4's combat is all about making the best decisions in any given situation for your own benefit. And I think that's what makes this game so fun and so infinitely replayable. Because it's so enthralling and because it's so deep, that not two playthroughs will ever feel the same. And fuck man, I even talked about the guns yet, which are another thing that makes this game so much fun. I shouldn't even have to say that. But the fun I have with RE4's gunplay is less about the guns themselves, but more so how I use them in a strategic manner. But of course, that's not to say the guns themselves aren't awesome, because they most certainly are. Several of RE4's encounters will have you swapping tactics and weapons on the fly, relative to what the current conflict entails. Oh, is that a huge crowd I see? Why don't I use a grenade or a flash? Get myself some space, then switch to the rifle so I can take out those archers. Oh, I'm fighting a stronger enemy in a smaller space? Blast him with the mine to stun him, switch to the TMP to sink some extra bits of damage before he recovers, then proceed to use my stronger weapons to finish him off. the thing I really love to prioritize doing in RE4 is to ensure that I'm dealing with these pursuers quickly while also minimizing how much ammo I'm using from my stronger weapons. It makes for some fun and strategic encounters, especially in some of the more erratic counters, such as the camp and defense segment or the minecart ride. Both of which have become iconic moments in the franchise for a reason. But there are a few, and when I say a few, I truly and honestly mean just a few gripes I had with this combat system. But aside from ones that are so minuscule they aren't even worth mention, I did find two things I didn't quite like about the combat. The first of which I guess could be excused because this game was essentially the first of its kind, so it's more of an understandable developer oversight. But anyway, I'm talking about the lack of a convenient way to switch weapons. Switching weapons is fun and all, but having to put the game on pause just to switch to another one? Yeah, not so much.
Huh?
The second issue I have revolves around the rocket launcher. It's a valuable tool, don't get me wrong, but it's busted as shit. It can kill every single boss sans Krauser and Sadler in one shot. They did at least try to balance things out by making it be a one-shot only weapon, but here's the thing. You can get it back very easily. They only cost like 30,000 pitas, so if you're selling treasure on a regular basis, you'll have another rocket launcher in no time. What I would have done to circumvent this is to add a price increase each and every time you go to buy a new one. Anyway, that's my 2 cents on the subject. Oh, did that guy whose head just exploded suddenly turn into a Ganado? Now he's got a giant fleshy sword thing swinging at me? Well, I'd better run back, keep my distance, and think of something else for now. Yeah, the more I talk about Resident Evil 4's combat, the more I gush about it, the more I... Yeah, it's a very good combat system. It's one of those kind of like... It's one of those where a situation can like change dramatically and you'll have to switch strategies, switch weapons, and shit like that. It keeps you on your toes. It keeps you second guessing. And that's what makes it so enthralling. That's what makes it so fun. That's what makes it so tense. That's what makes me coming back to it. And this is more so the case on like professional difficulty, where not only every shot counts, but every time you get hit counts, because you'll take damage pretty quickly. So you're not gonna want to play things safe at all. You're gonna make sure every shot counts. You're gonna make sure that you'll need to switch the right weapons at the right time. You're gonna make sure to use the right strategies at the right time. You're gonna look for openings, look for weaknesses, and exploit them. That's what you'll need to do on professional difficulty. And it is insane. It is mind-boggling. Especially later on in the game, when you fight some really fucking insane enemies, like these giant Goliath fucking dudes with like a huge axe and armor that like is pretty much untouchable unless A, you're using a heavy weapon like the mine launcher or whatever, or B, you got yourself a good fucking aim. And of course, the regenerators. Speaking of like that guy and the regenerators, I love how not only the enemy design will force you into switching tactics on the fly at like any given time, how things just dramatically change, but the enemy design does have a bit of nuance to where you can craft several different ways of taking them out, like the regenerators. And by the way, the introduction of the regenerators is actually so brilliant. You enter a laboratory and you see some really fucking disgusting things that don't compare to anything you've seen prior in the game. Like, look what's on that bed there. Even Leon is concerned. I would be too. The intensity just spikes up and it keeps going up and up and up, because you know something is about to happen. Something is not right. But then all of a sudden, you hear like this and this really creepy drone and ambient music, and then you're faced with an enemy that you can't kill. You're sinking shot after shot after shot after shot, and nothing's happening. The first time you fight them, you can't kill them at all, really. So obviously you'll eventually discover a way to actually kill them. And this way to kill them comes in the form of a thermal scope that allows you to see these little Las Plagas. Here's the thing though, there is one on its back that you can't reach. So naturally, you'll have to think of a way around that. Will you, A, try to save as much ammo as you can by carefully shooting it in the back, because you can do that. If you notice, when you shoot one of the Las Plagas, it'll like flail around or whatever, and it'll expose its back for like a split second. And in that split second, you can pop that final Las Plagas on its back, which will reduce your ammo as much as you can. But you can also shoot its legs to where it just exposes it completely, to making it to where it's the easiest to shoot. But then again, that'll be the method that wastes most ammo. So yeah, lots of things to think about with not only switching weapons at correct times, but like using those weapons to exploit enemy weaknesses. Because every enemy does have a weakness. And even with like the smaller enemies, like the shield guys, you can just pop them in the feet, which is riskier, but will save your ammo for your shotgun. Or you can use your shotgun, which has less risk, but then again, you're just wasting shotgun ammo. Lots of risk reward and lots of trade-offs in this game. Damn. Holy fuck. This is a good combat system. I'm still in shock and awe at how good this is, and I've played this 6 fucking times. And it's also a game where you discover new shit to do every time. Damn. Yeah, I better stop gawking and move on to the bosses. Jesus Christ. RE4's lineup of bosses is pretty damn solid and are among the franchise's finest. Not really. Yeah, to be honest, the bosses can be kinda I mean, they are good. They are designed good, but there is an issue with them that I will get to later on. But anyway, from a design standpoint, they're good. Not really a super weak one amongst a bunch, except for Sadler and Del Lago. The former, because as a final boss, he's not the best, especially compared to some of those highlights earlier in the game, like Krauser, for example. And Del Lago, well, he's the first boss, so I can't be too harsh on him. First bosses usually aren't the best, except for like Cerberus from DMC3. That's like the best example of a first boss. But anyway, I will say that the sound effects of the spears piercing his skin is oddly satisfying to me. But anyway, getting to the bosses that are actually great. There are a ton of fantastic bosses in this game, especially guys like Vertigo and U3, both of which are not only fun from a gameplay standpoint, but because of the atmospheric tension they deliver as well. Vertigo in particular is incredible in this regard. As I watched the cutscenes with Salazar, I couldn't help but wonder what these giant, lanky-ass monsters were capable of. Because they're clad in this fucking awesome robe, they're holding a spear, and they're protecting Salazar. Like, you know you're going to fight them eventually, and you're just sitting there like, I wonder what this guy is gonna do. After saving yourself from falling through a pit and watching one of the funniest cutscenes in the game, you now know that one's being sent after you. The player is immediately put on high alert as you continuously dodge attacks from above or below as it traverses through this really creepy underground sewer cave thing. All the while, their full appearance remained concealed. Because like they're in a roll the entire time, so you don't know what exactly they look like, so you got that to look forward to. Anyway, that is until you get stuck in a room, having to wait a few minutes for it to open, and that's when our mutated cockroach buddy finally shows himself. It's such a fantastic segment altogether. The build-up to his appearance, that foreboding tension, the QTEs, the fight itself is amazing too. It's one of those bosses where you really have to be smart with your arsenal, because his armor is damn near impenetrable, not to mention his ludicrous speed being factored in as well. Like, this motherfucker's fast. It's all about having the reflexes to dodge his attacks and knowing when or not to actually shoot him. It's a tough boss fight for sure, but one that is super satisfying to beat. That is, unless you're a little pussy like me and just decided to freeze them, then instantly shove a rocket up their ass. Another boss fight that shares this very same quality is the Krauser fight. Goddamn, this might as well be the best boss in the series because it just nails every single thing. Like, let's run through the list, shall we? Tension. Yep. There are literal ticking time bombs surrounding the area, incentivizing you to kill him quickly. Hasten. Oh yeah, this boss fight is frantic as all hell. Fucking hell. Varied. There are 3 phases to this boss, and each one is different and still require a different skill set from the player, but still avoid the issue of feeling out of place. Good mechanics? Definitely. This is the fight where all the skills you learned are put to the test. From precise aiming to well-timed knife attacks to having fast reflexes. Like that first phase, you're gonna have to watch Krauser's every movement and make sure it doesn't get too close or else you're gonna get fucked up. Unless you have good enough reflexes to use to win the QTEs and avoid his attacks. But you're also gonna have to figure out how to get around his speed and maneuvering mechanics to actually hit him. Yeah, that first phase is great. All the phases are great, but that first one is definitely the toughest and most rewarding and most satisfying in my mind. But anyway, despite all the praise I shared towards these bosses, I will say that each and every one of them share a common problem. Cheese. Yeah, unfortunately, every boss in Resident Evil 4 can be cheesed pretty easily. And I'm not just talking about the rocket launcher method either. Like, Chief Mendez gets absolutely crumbled by incendiary grenades. And the aforementioned Krauser, as fantastic as he is, can get wrecked by the knife and will die quickly if you're able to keep him in the corner during his third and final phase. But that only applies to his final form. But his first 2 phases are still fairly difficult. Anyway, it's just so funny with how challenging a lot of the regular encounters tended to be. The actual boss fights can get killed easily, using the cheapest methods, even on a professional. So yeah, getting back to what I said initially in the beginning of this segment, this is the one problem I do have with the bosses. They're so pretty well designed bosses, because they all allow for different strategies out of the player, but my only wish is that, well, they were a bit tougher and a lot less exploitive. Cause yeah, they can be exploited pretty easily. Anyway, that's the only issue I have with the bosses. The bosses are so very fun, and I look forward to fighting them each time I go back to them. And if you don't cheese them, they're fun to fight. They're fun to fight the way the developers intended, but still, cheese is cheese, and that's all. That's my 2 cents. That's all.
You okay?
Yeah.
Oh boy. Oh boy. It's story time. Throughout my first batch of Resident Evil reviews, I was never really looking forward to covering the game's stories, mainly because it's not as significant as with the games I usually play. You know, because I'm used to shit like Final Fantasy, Like a Dragon, Kingdom Hearts, Metal Gear Solid. So yeah, I usually play story-centric games. So when I have to talk about a game where the story is not really important, I get kind of sleepy. And the only reason I do bother covering the story is because I feel obligated to, I'll admit. But anyway, I actually feel the complete opposite with Resident Evil 4's story. I was fucking waiting to finally begin talking about the story. But not because it's bad or because it's masterful and like the best fucking narrative known to man. Like Final Fantasy VI, Metal Gear Solid 3 looks like dog shit compared to this fucking subtle thematic masterpiece. Because it is such an unserious series of happenings that are so blissfully ridiculous that it never ceases to entertain me. Holy hell, Resident Evil 4's story is so completely batshit insane that I just cannot imagine how anyone could not love it. And the main source of all this insanity is our main protagonist, Leon Kennedy. With his typical 80s action flick bravado, complete with goofy one-liners, remarkable mispronunciation, and flirtatious behavior. He's got all the ingredients of a wacky Saturday morning cartoon hero, and normally that would be cringe, disgusting, and disgustingly cringe. But he manages to somehow work. Why? Because everybody and everything around him are so reminiscent of an 80s Saturday morning cartoon. You've got the annoying damsel in distress, the spooky foreign thread who hates America, the promiscuous femme fatale, and the old friend turned villain cliche. This shouldn't work. None of this should ever fucking work. This should have been the worst shit ever. None of this should ever fucking work. It should have been the worst shit ever. It wouldn't work in literally anything else, and yet it manages to work here because the writing is so unapologetically tongue-in-cheek and so aware of its own absurdity that it just rolls with the punches, goes with the flow. You know how the original Resident Evil is goofy but unintentionally so due to horrific voice acting and the woes of early 3D gaming in general? Well, Resident Evil 4 is the inverse of that. It's goofy because it wants to be and doesn't give a shit about what other people say. And it is glorious. The amount of memorable one-liners and general dialogue is enough to fill an hour-long compilation. They're corny and goofy as all hell, but with just enough self-awareness to make it funny without having to feel too cynical. And to make things even better, Leon develops rather strong dynamics between him and his castmates. Examples include Luis, whose mirrored personality made for some fun exchanges. Luis is basically the Spanish equivalent of Leon. So seeing these two interact, it makes for some pretty awesome fucking moments. Even though Leon outright mispronounces his name on several occasions. This motherfucker, he pronounces Luis as the American Lewis, even when he's dying, and he's calling out his name as he's fading on his deathbed. He still doesn't pronounce his name right. Maybe this was intentional to make Leon even goofier, or maybe it was an oversight of some sort. I don't know. It's funny as hell either way. We also have the villains whom he shares memorable interactions with. His banter with Salazar and Saddler in particular made for some of the most hilarious moments in the game. There's a reason why lines such as "your right hand comes off" and "Saddler, you're small time" has been recited over and over again for the past 18 years. And on that note, I love the contrast between Salazar and Saddler's reaction to Leon's banter. The former is clearly pissed off and will eventually throw a temper tantrum, whereas the latter is all like, "Yeah, come at me, you American swine. I can turn into a giant flesh scorpion. The fuck you gonna do against that?" It really goes to show you who's running things and who's merely the underling. Another thing I like to point out with Salazar is that him being 20 years old is probably the strangest age he could have been. And that makes him an even funnier and more unserious character. Getting back on track, as sharp as the writing can be most of the time, I felt as if the actual story kind of fell flat. The files are kind of generic, and the narrative itself is kind of generic as well. It all feels typical and written with tropes. But honestly, I'm fine with this undercooked narrative because the writers were able to give us some of the franchise's best comedic moments, while still having the ability to keep things serious when they need to be. That's what's called playing to your strengths. It's kind of what Devil May Cry does. Not to discredit the actual narrative nuance and strength of Devil May Cry, because it certainly has those. Anyway, and Resident Evil 4 plays to its strengths quite well. I'd argue that the remake handled the story far better, but I'll get to that when the time's necessary. And while we're on the topic of remakes, god fucking damn, did Capcom deliver yet another incredible remake. Hell, it might as well be the best one they've ever done by this point. Yes, I think I might like it better than the RE1 remake. I will have to play it again to make sure. But even in spite of the remake's mind-blowing quality, it still can't replace its original counterpart. They still offer their own unique experiences after all. The original Resident Evil 4 is still one of the greatest video games ever made, regardless of era or genre. The addicting, diverse combat, combined with this equally addicting sense of urgency, resulted in a gameplay loop that by itself justifies its spot as one of the all-time greats. But additional things such as atmosphere, writing, and pacing catapulted this game into being something truly special. A game that hardly anyone has been able to replicate and, like I said before, is only rivaled by its own remake. If you're into shooter games, horror games, 6th generation games, or hell, just video games in general, I urge you to give this game a shot. And if you're worried about piracy and not having the right tools to emulate it, or moral obligations to not emulate, well, worry not, because this game is available on every platform known to fucking man. It's basically like Minecraft at this point. What's more is that Capcom games always seem to go on sale from what I've noticed. Like anytime I see this game in the store, it's always on sale. But anyway, Resident Evil 4, one of the greats. It's still in my all-time top 10. And speaking of 10, that's what I'm gonna score it. A nice and light 9 to a strong 10.
It's enough to make a grown man cry.
Obviously, this game isn't completely perfect and had a few aspects I wasn't super crazy about, hence the light 9. But as an overall game, it's just hard to really compete with it. See you bitches later.